I'm Nakuset. I'm the Executive Director of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. This presentation is going to be in English. So if you need les écouteurs, I believe they're in the hallway, right? Right? There you go. Okay. So anyone need to go and get translation? I see people walking. Okay. Unfortunately, today I'm a little bit under time constraints, so I'm literally gonna do my thing for 45 minutes or 40 minutes. Can you do a favor for me, Nathan, and be like a time person? Just like tell me when I have 5 minutes left. And then if you have any questions, just jam them in the last 5 minutes because I have to run and get my kids. Okay, so I want to thank Nathan for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I've been working at the Native Women's Shelter for the last 20 years. I'm Cree, originally from Lac La Ronge, Saskatchewan. I'm part of the 60 Scoop. So I was brought here when I was 3 years old and adopted into a Jewish family, and this is the only home that I've known. So when I got my education, when I eventually got my Indian status, I wanted to dedicate my life to working with Indigenous people. And I saw that our people were having a really difficult time, especially those that we're all affected by residential school and 60 Scoop. So here in the city, I would see a lot of our people on the streets. You know, if you walk down the street to Cabot Square, you're going to see a lot of our people there, and that they're struggling, and that really there isn't really enough services for Indigenous people. So what I wanted to do was get my education and see if I could figure out a way where I could help them. When I started working at the Native Women's Shelter, it was a very small organization. It probably had only around 10 staff. Maybe there was rooms for about maybe 15 women and their children. And then eventually it grew. I've been there for 20 years. So, and the whole idea of the Native Women's Shelter was created because Indigenous women would go home with strangers just to find a safe place to sleep, and that wasn't necessarily safe. So the Native Friendship Center did a study many years ago, and through that study they created a needs assessment, and then they got funding. So we have been around since 1987, and we have been growing. So once I started working at the Native Women's Shelter, when I started I was a frontline worker, and then I was an outreach worker, liaison worker, conference coordinator, and moved my way up the ladder until I was eventually the executive director. When I became an executive director, I used that power by going to other organizations and trying to alert them of our needs and how can we start to change things. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Cabot Square. So I do have slides. Some of them have information. I may not necessarily be reading the slides, so I'll be putting them up and you can take a look at them, and I'm a bit more of a storyteller, so I'm going to do that instead. So this is Cabot Square. In Montreal, there used to be a hospital that was right across from it, and a lot of Indigenous people would come into the city to use those hospitals and kind of hang out at the park while they were waiting, either going out for a cigarette break or just sort of for some relief of having the children in the hospital, and they would see Indigenous people there. So it has always been an area where we could congregate. So I know that if I want to see an Indigenous face, that's where I'm going. There is no urban reserve. This is the closest thing. Now, what they decided to do a couple of years ago was to revitalize the area, which meant that they were going to put condos up all around. And part of the revitalization was to change the look of this park. There used to be a lot of grass. See, that's all grass there. That's all gone. And in order to change the park, they needed to actually put fences up, so all the population of our people were not allowed in that park for almost a year. And they wanted to put the population elsewhere. So I remember sitting at a meeting and they were like, I think what we should do, so when I say at a meeting, it's a community table where I am the only Indigenous person there. And they said at this meeting, there's a problem with the people in the park. We need to move them. I think maybe like behind the Omer de Serre, there's like an alleyway. That's where we should put the people. And I was like, really? I don't think that's going to happen. But in order to sort of counteract this idea, I went back and talked to a couple of people from a justice committee I was sitting on, and I explained to them, this is their solution. We need to do better. I have to go back to that meeting, and I have to present a better idea. I already had this plan that it would be great if we could keep the people in the park and have outreach workers. So I worked with Vivian Carley, who at the time was working for the International Center for the Prevention of Crime, and we looked at best practices across Canada, and we made a proposal, and we handed it in. And they were like, oh, that's nice, but it looks expensive, and how do you know it's going to work? So we started to create this thing called the Cabot Square Project. So this is where I told you I'm going to put slides up but not necessarily go through them. What we had to do was create a research. We had to show the city that there is a problem and that we know what the solution is. So that took at least 6 months to create a research that they were happy with. And, you know, when I first sat at that meeting where they were telling me that they were going to put the Indigenous people in a parking lot, until we got to the point where we were creating a research, took a couple of years. After the research was done, it took another couple of years to actually get it into action. So if anything, we are resilient and we're pretty stubborn, because we know what we have to do and we know what works. So here's another one that I'm not going to necessarily read. These are all different, you know, sort of studies that we had to bring forward to show the people why there is an issue and to give them a better understanding. And when I say the people, I'm talking more about city officials. So we had to plead to the Ville de Montréal. We got funding eventually from a Secretary des Affaires autochtones. So we had to let them know this is what the reality is, and this is what we could eventually do. So what I wanted to do originally was keep the people in the park and give them services. And originally what I wanted was 4 outreach workers. And I wanted 2 Inuit outreach workers that would work from 8 until 4. And then 2 First Nations outreach workers. It's really important, like the Inuit language is very, very well preserved. Like I don't speak my language, I'm Cree, but the Inuit are very strong in their language. So we wanted our Inuit workers to speak to the people in their own language, to have a better understanding. And then to have 2 outreach workers in the evening that were First Nations, and then what I really wanted was to have something that we called a mediator. So basically, it's this person that has a background in security. So it's not like a police officer, but sort of like a police officer, because they could sort of keep people safe. So if there's a conflict in the park, and if there's an altercation and, you know, a woman or a man is getting beaten, he could step in. Because right now, the only other solution is to call the police, and that's never a good thing. Because we have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in jail, and there's a lot of racial profiling here in Montreal. That's another workshop. But we don't want people to go to jail. So if we have a mediator, not only could he intervene, if people are completely under the influence, he can sit down, have a conversation with them. And he would have a trusting relationship with them, and he wouldn't be in uniform. And that way, the outreach workers can actually work with the individuals that are in the park and find out, what are you doing here? How can I help you? Are you looking for housing? Are you looking for a job? Do you need to go to the hospital? The outreach workers would have bus tickets so that they could bring people to wherever it is they want to go. So this is what I originally wanted. What I got was something different. But I really need that mediator position. And the reason is we had one set of condos built. 1, 2. We have now where the children's hospital used to be, that's all going to be condos. So that's 2021. Yeah. So there's going to be pushback. And where the miso restaurant is, that's going to also be all condos. So the people that are in the park are really at a vulnerable state. And then on top of it, there used to be a really great shelter around the area called the Open Door, and we shared clientele. Well, now that place is gone. Now, I've been sitting on this committee for years. So wait, let me just flip this because I'm supposed to show you slides and whatever. I'm not reading them. I'm just going with the storytelling. But I've been talking to the city for years about what are they going to do about this? Are you going to be creating another shelter in the area? Are you going to be creating a place that's safe for women that in the evenings, because the only other area shelter is Chez Doris, and they close like at a certain time, I think at like 3 o'clock. So what happens to the women? So I really need that mediator position because they're not sort of stepping up. I was lucky, I don't know if I'm lucky, but I've been asked to sit on the sort of planning committee of the new children's hospital. They're trying to get different people to sit in there and give them their point of views. And because, you know, of course, I'll be the only Indigenous person there, and I'll tell them what I think, because I'm not really shy about that. But that could be something that comes out in a good way. We'll see. It's really, I've just been invited. I haven't actually attended any meetings yet to that. It's all very new. But we know that there's going to be pushback. And we already see that there's a lot more despair in the area because of the Open Door leaving. So what is going to happen this summer? See, that particular park has a lot of activity in the evenings. In the summertime, they like to have activities where they do swing dancing, and they'll have a movie night, and they'll have, I don't know, almost every single night they have an activity where the general public is allowed to come in. And if our people are there already, what they want is our outreach workers to be like security, to deal with the people, but that's not really their job. They're there to be supportive. They're not security. But if I get that mediator position, he can do that because he'll already have a relationship with them. Plus, you know, he's sort of, in my mind, I mean, he doesn't exist yet, but he would be someone that can sort of de-escalate. So if he sees, you know, body language that looks like people are upset or whatever, he can sit down, have a conversation with them. Worst case scenario, they will call the police, but we really don't want that because we don't have a good relationship with the police. All I'm hearing this week is about Station 20. And it's not good what I'm hearing, you know. And on top of it, when they go into the metros, the STM personnel are not good. They're not good. So it's sort of like I have to sit, I mean, my job at the Native Women's Shelter, I'm not there that often because I'm running around the city trying to make sure that we're just being treated respectfully. Okay, so remember that first picture I showed you, Cabot Square? This is what it looks like now. See? Now that is the Vespasian. So the other half of that building is where my outreach worker works. So David Crane works there. So I have one outreach worker who's Soto, and there's another outreach worker that the City of Montreal pays for from the YMCA, and that's Brandon. So they share the other half of the space, and they're there Monday to Friday, like 8 to 4. The other half is the Roundhouse Cafe, and it's supposed to be an Indigenous, how do I say this? It is run by l'Itinéraire, but they hire a lot of Indigenous people to sort of service the people that come in. They get paid to work there, but they're only open like half the year. So I think they're opening next month or something like that. So we work with them as well. Okay. That's what, see, look up. Remember I told you the grass? I don't see no grass, right? They got a tiny little bit, but that's not it. And if you even look at the way that it's, they built it, it's pretty much no sleeping allowed. You know, there were skateboarders at one point. They kind of liked that, but, you know, because of the curves there. But they designed it in a way that's not comfortable. And, oh, wait a minute, I have to say this. See this ground? That's a $4 million ground. Yeah, they, I think I'm like, I shouldn't say it too much, but anyways, I hope there's no one here from the Ville de Montréal. But it's true. It's a $4 million ground that apparently if it rains, then the rain gets sucked into that ground and feeds the trees. They didn't think about the winter, though. So there's a lot of issues with that ground. Anyway, so the thing was that when I started wanting to do the Cabot Square Project, really the idea was to keep the people in the park safe. But then it's sort of like, well, it's great that you're helping your people, but nobody in the condos wants to come into the building or into the park. So what do we do? So we thought about it for a while, and a group of us were talking, and personally, my adopted family really likes soapstone sculptures. They love them. They used to have so many of them in their house, and they used to show it to me and be like, look, it's your people. And I'm like, no, it's not, but they are very pretty. So what we wanted to do was, you know, have people make soapstone sculptures, have workshops where people kind of take a look at the culture and see it and can feel it and can actually create and speak to the people, have a different conversation, have a different perspective. So that's what we decided to do. And we spoke to the city and they were on board. So every year what we do is we have Aboriginal Friday. So remember I talked to you about how the city has in the summer all these other different evenings. We get the afternoons every single Friday. So we try to promote it. This one you could look at. All right, so first of all, most importantly, it's written in Inuktitut because we really wanted the community members to know that they are also part of the solution. And then we have like hoop dancing. This guy comes all the way from Arizona. He's coming back for Aboriginal Day. You should come to Aboriginal Day. I throw a big party. Aboriginal Day is June 21st, by the way, but of course you all knew that. So, but this is not included. I have to get separate funding for that. This is different. So we have soapstone carving workshops, and those are our most popular workshops. And more importantly, the guys that do the soapstone are on the streets. So they have been hired year after year doing soapstone, working with the people, and they get all these different contracts on their own. So now people are changing their perception when they see them on the street. They're not like, oh, you get over it. They're like, hey, can you carve me a dancing bear for my cousin? And Rosanna Deerchild just came down last summer. She has a show on the radio, and they interviewed the guys. So they're like superstars now. That's what I like. So these are the guys from Arizona again that come down. We have a really big day. We also have the Buffalo Hat Singers that come down. And here's another picture. And you'll see like the community comes out. So you'll see Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people. We have different kiosks that come so that they can advertise their services so people can have an understanding about what services are there out there for Indigenous people. So basically what I need to do now for Cabot Square is find myself a mediator, because we're going to be doing all these activities again, and those condos are coming, and I think that when people take a look at the area, I'm thinking I want to move in here, but I'm not quite sure about the people in the park, and if our people are in despair, what is the solution? If I don't find this particular person to work there, it's going to be the police that are coming, and I really don't want that. How am I doing for time, by the way? I talk too much. but I only got 40 minutes, 45. Great, okay. So, now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. So, like I said, I've been working at the Native Women's Shelter for 20 years now. And we have a shelter that provides services for Indigenous women and their children. We're the only shelter in Montreal that does that. The children part. There are shelters like PAC, but if you have children, you can't stay there. So the thing is, once the women decide that they want to leave the shelter, there's not really that many places for them to go. Because if they don't make enough money, then where are they going to stay? So at the shelter, we have a lot of services. They can come to the shelter and all the women have their own rooms. We have a lot of in-house programming. So over the years, we've created more. We have an addictions worker, because 85% of our clientele have problems with addictions. We have a family care worker, because we are overrepresented in youth protection. So almost every woman that comes in either has had her child taken away or is in the process of it. So we need to hire people that are advocates that can really explain how the law protection or youth protection works and what their rights are, because, you know, for Indigenous people, you know, we had the residential school where they took our children and it was the law. We were not allowed to keep our children. And that was almost 200 years of residential school. Then they started the 60 scoop. So really, we expect youth protection to take our children away. That's what society has taught us. Well, now we're reversing that. By hiring family care workers, we're empowering the women. And they'll work with the women who are currently in-house and also when they leave. The women at the shelter can stay there for 3 months, and then what happens after 3 months? So we also have other services at the shelter. I have a psychologist. Okay, so if you don't know about being a treaty Indian, the government gives us 10 sessions from a psychologist for free. Because after 10 sessions, we're cured, right? Anyway, so how it works usually is if I want to go see a psychologist, I just give her my Indian status number, and then she bills the government and they pay her. So I had a talk with Health Canada. I'm like, just give me the money. Give me the money, and we'll have a contribution agreement, and the women who come in will have that service, and they'll have as many sessions as they want. And, you know, after 2 or 3 years, eventually I got the money, and it's ongoing. Every year I have to renew it. But our women can come in and they can have that as soon as they walk in the door. We also have a sweat lodge at the Botanical Gardens. We have an elder that comes in. So we try to do a lot of in-house programming. And that programming is really, really helpful. But what happens after 3 months? Where are they going to go if they don't make enough money? And then youth protection could be kind of like, well, we're not going to release your children unless you have, you know, a bedroom with X amount of bedrooms. So you need like a 5.5 because you have like, you know, 4 children. And if you can't afford, then do your kids stay in youth protection longer? Chances are they do. So what we want to do is build a second stage housing. And we have been talking about it. I also have outreach services. I have an outreach worker named Teely that helps women as soon as they leave the shelter or have never been in the shelter. Plus I have the Cabot Square worker. Plus I have a missing and murder Indigenous women's coordinator, an Ishkwe project. So I really try to sort of go beyond the scope of the shelter. But once they leave the shelter, we need to help them. And right now there's nothing. And the thing with supportive housing, they have them in Montreal, second stage housing, but not for women and children. Just women. So you're going to give up your kids so you can like live in a supportive place? That's really not going to work. 10 years we have been talking about this. So right now there is no second stage housing, but we've been working with this organization called Bâtir son quartier. Anybody know them? Okay. I'm working with Yann. And we've been working with him for 10 years because we really needed to find the right place. He would propose, oh, let's put a place that's like in Longueuil. I'm like, yeah, but my people are not in Longueuil, so why would we send them so far away, especially if they have, you know, children that are in youth protection in the cities, the addiction centers. You know, when our kids are taken away, they give us like a gajillion measures that we have to follow. So let's put it somewhere more, more close to the downtown area. So we've been working with him for a very, very long time. I mean, I'm talking like 2 babies ago. Yeah. So eventually, they found something for us, and even better, it was close by the shelter, which is what I would like. And we also wanted something that was culturally appropriate, because I know that they have this housing first idea where basically they just want to put people in apartments, just put them in, and then they walk away. And I remember reading a story in the Gazette a year ago or 2 years ago about this guy who was part of the 60 Scoop, and they put him in an apartment. And as soon as they put him in the apartment, he would sleep there, wake up in the morning, go back to the streets and stay in the streets all day, because he doesn't want to be all by himself in an apartment. He wants to have some kind of sense of community, and he couldn't really find it. So this is what we want to do, is have a sense of community in our second stage housing. So yeah, poor Yan, we gave him such a tall order about what we wanted, but that's why it took 10 years. So now we're going to open in 2021. We're going to have 3 floors, and we're going to have 23 units. So we're going to have some for single women, but mostly for women and children. And we're going to, I remember when we talked to the architects, and we were like, okay, we need it to be culturally appropriate. And he's like, what does that mean? It means that if we want to smudge, it's not going to rain on our head, because like the fire alarm is going to go off. We need to be able to do that. We need to have a specific area where we can have like workshops, where we can, bring the community together. And even though every single room, I'm going to make sure it's fully furnished, but every single room will have a kitchen, we need a community kitchen. So when it comes to celebrations, ceremonies, important days, we can have, a kitchen where we all get together and cook together, and then go into the other room and eat together. And we would also have this designated room for workshops, so we could bring people in from, urban referral services, sort of the First Nations Human Resources Development of Quebec. Someone who comes in and teaches about, getting up your skills for going into the workforce, or what jobs are out there, or just people coming in giving actual workshops. So we need that. All right, so this is what it looks like right now. It's not too pretty. This is the building that Bâtir son quartier found for us. It used to be a bathhouse. So they're going to make it look better than this. They're going to actually make it larger, but it's really falling apart. No one has used it for like 20 years, and you could see there's gates around it because you really, really can't go in. Here's another version of it. Yeah. This is what it looks like inside currently. You ready? Not so pretty. Yeah. Nice skylight. That's another one. But this is the vision. This is what it will look like. So, it's going to be taller. We still haven't decided on how it's going to work in terms of, where we're going to put the children with the parents, maybe at the bottom floor, because you have kids running upstairs. They're like, oh, those kids are running around. So maybe we'll put them at the bottom. We haven't quite figured all that out. What we need to do is get the funding for it. So, and I work really hard in trying to bring monies in. It's really Bâtir son quartier's job to do that, but wherever I have a chance to, ask for money, then I will. So I went to Secretariat des Affaires Autochtones, and they have some kind of infrastructure monies. And I met with them, and, they said, well, we only give $600,000. And I'm like, yeah, I'll take it. But it took 2 years. I mean, really, this is like a $7 million building, right? So far I got $600,000. We got $750,000 just recently from SHQ, Société Habitation de Québec. We have, I think, $20,000 from the Accès Logis project program from the City of Montreal. The City of Montreal has definitely given us the building. But, you know, there's a lot of work to do. Here's another picture. I actually held a press conference last year around this time asking Justin Trudeau to give us the $7 million because he goes to the UN and he's like, the plight of Aboriginal people, and I really want to help them. So I wrote a really beautiful letter. I'm like, yeah, $7 million check, send it over here. I'll make you look good, Justin. And he needs that now. Yeah. And most importantly, right, see that green area? We are going to be having like a garden area where the women can work, you know, with the land, because we're like land-based people. We want to work with the land, and this is something that they can develop. And I think I have one more picture. Well, you can't really see it that good, but whoops, let me go back. What you can't see is where the green is. That particular spot over there, is going to be clear, so the women can actually see out from there, and that's where we're going to be having our conference room, or our room where we gather together, so they can actually look outside and they can, you know, sort of envision, you know, like a brighter future. That's really important. So what I want to do is have everyone, you know, has a place to stay, but on Mondays our addictions worker will be there. Tuesday our family care workers, Wednesday our psychologist, Thursday our elder, and Friday we'll have our art therapist. She works with the children as well, so that's really helpful, because sometimes they can't always, you know, say what they feel, but they can draw it. And that way they know that when they come downstairs, they can sign up and say, okay, so today I'm gonna go and, you know, see whoever is coming if I feel like it. They could stay there for up to 2 to 3 years. So what we want to do is kind of help them to build a strong foundation if they want to go into the workforce or if they want to finish their education, but have them stay there so that when they finally step out, they can envision, you know, a future for themselves. Because we all deserve a chance. And I think with Indigenous people, we haven't really got a chance. But, you know, some of us are able to sort of plow the way. And I think, you know, in my personal experience, that's something that I get to do. Like, I'm very lucky to have my job, and I'm lucky that I have the strength to do the work that I do. And this is my $7 million baby. So even though, I mean, I'm doing a lot of other projects with the shelter, but I'm really focused on this one. And, you know, I'm really hoping that we will open in 2021. I won't be running it, if anybody wants a job. No. I'm going to be staying at the Native Women's Shelter, but this will be a fully functional second stage housing. I'll probably have 2 staff there. And like I said, what's awesome is that the shelter is not far away. So if there's anyone in crisis, you know, we have the staff who can come over and have, you know, spend some time with them. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm done. If you have questions. So if you have any questions, now's your time to ask them, because I gotta run, like the wind. I see someone over there, their hand up.
So I grew up in Little Brittany, and I've been living there for the last 19 years, and it's really neat to see this project coming up. And I just wanted to, thank you. I just wanted to say that if you need sort of to build networks within the community, to build links with like the Comité de Santé or something, you could reach out to me, or I could send you an email. And if like building solidarity networks within the community is something of interest to you, I'd be more than happy to get you connected.
That's awesome. I'm going to give you my card.
For sure.
The thing is that someone had said to me recently, they're like, well, what if they don't want you there? I'm like, what do you mean? Why would they not want us there? But the truth is, sometimes communities are like that. They're like, well, we don't want Indians there. We don't want, you're all a bunch of drunks, like when all the like ugliness comes out. But, you know, like the shelter has been where it's been for, you know, like 30 years now. So we've never really had issues. So we're hoping that's going to continue. And like I said, it's second stage housing. It's for women that we're going to evaluate the women prior to them going there to see if they are able to sustain this. If not, if they're having addictions issues, then, you know, we'll make sure that they work on that first, go into in-treatment if that's what's needed, and then when they're ready, then they'll come in.
Absolutely. I noticed the building looks like some of the Indian residential schools.
Wow, didn't even think about that.
What's going to be done about that in terms of triggering trauma?
I am not even sure. Like these floor plans that I'm showing you right here, that I don't even know if that's what it's actually going to look like. But I mean, for sure, when we open, we're gonna, definitely have an elder that comes. And does a ceremony. I mean, we're really not there yet. And honestly, I hadn't even thought about that. It used to be a bathhouse. Right now, there's a big sort of issue with the city because they want it to be a, what do you call that? A building. They don't want to change the facade because it means something to them. Heritage building, yes. So far, we've had about 3 or 4 different designs. The last one that we looked at didn't even look at all recognizable. The only thing that this is what we have to keep. That's residential school?
It's residential school.
Okay, well then I'll speak to people to see what I don't know if we can necessarily change that. But I mean, we can see what we can do in the future. I'll give you my card as well. So when we get our final floor plans, we can talk about it. Whole bunch. Okay, here you go. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing this information with us and your work. My question is about the mediators and the parks, and I think mediation is something that we need to be thinking about on a large scale, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods where police are kind of like the main agents of enforcing gentrification, right, and making sure that the so-called undesirable folks are out. So how have you had any experience where the mediators are in conflict with the police or any other state agency, and or do you anticipate that might happen, and how to navigate that?
Well, the position is so new that it kind of freaks everyone out. And we had a talk with Carlo. I don't know if you know Montreal, but Carlo is the Aboriginal liaison officer who's Italian. Yeah. So, and when it was presented, the idea to him, he really didn't understand what it was. So I think what we're going to have to do is sort of explain it, because they never actually had this type of mediator yet in Montreal. They've had it in other cities. But they would be working there, like in their job description, it's like working with the police. The police are going to know them. They're going to have to do a lot of, it's not easy working with the police. I mean, I was just, at a meeting with them last week, and it's really hard for them to take any accountability for their behaviors on racial profiling, on, oh my God, like horror stories, right? So I think this person who eventually we hire is going to have to really have those kind of key communication skills to be able to make sure that the most important thing is protecting our people, and also having a relationship with the police and calling in those that are helpful. There are certain police officers that are helpful, and we know who they are. And especially in that area, there's only certain police that are allowed to go in that area. And I think next week there's going to be a meeting with the outreach workers and the new BEP, which is the Brigade Espace Public, the police that go on the bikes, and they're usually the ones with the tasers and are not fairly nice. So they're going to have to be sort of one of those people that can charm the police but help our people. So like I said, right now the position does not exist. I got to find the money for it, because I keep putting it up, but the city hasn't actually bought into it. I did have a conversation with someone from the Ville de Montréal, and they said, listen, if you can try to find some of the monies, we can put up the rest until you find monies for the future. And Makavik also has a funding source, but it only would start next summer. So I'm pretty much looking everywhere. That's what I'm doing Monday morning when I go to work. I'm like, find me the money. Not easy. Is that it?
Any more questions? Josh?
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could describe a little bit more about the process of working with this other organization. I don't know what the organization that's helped you find a location.
Quartiers, you mean?
Yeah, I don't know what they do. I'm from Toronto, so apologies for my ignorance on that. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the process that you have had with them and what the relationship is between the two organizations in terms of your collaboration. And then, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so it's a long time that we've been putting this process together. So I met them literally 10 years ago. It was the board of directors of the Native Women's Shelter that visioned this second stage housing. And talking to other shelters in Montreal, we found that they also worked with this organization. So there are other shelters that are day or 24-hour shelters, but also have a second stage attached to it, and they recommended this organization. This organization is also the one that helped develop PAC, Projet Autochtone de Québec, because they're also a shelter, plus they have a second stage. So they came recommended. The thing with us is that we were very clear about what we wanted. Had we said, yes, just build anything, anywhere, that's fine with us, we probably would have had this earlier. But because we wanted something very specific near the shelter in downtown area, it's taken longer. And what they do is they write all the proposals and they send them out, and they find the architects and the person who sort of checks the land to make sure that it's not contaminated, and bring in all those specialized people that I have no idea about. They bring all those people in. I discuss it with my board of directors and say, okay, he's, talking about hiring this person. What do you think? And we have a lot of trust in them. So, but we are very specific about what we need to make sure that it's culturally appropriate. So we keep bringing those points in, and it's sort of always negotiating with them. But right now, what we need is the money. So he's in the process, and eventually I will go with him to go and speak to key people about, making sure that this project goes smoothly. So I'm waiting. Basically, I wait for him to say, hey, we need to go and meet the mayor. But apparently the city of Montreal already knows about this. I think Craig Sauvé is the guy, the city councilor that's working on these kinds of these projects in the area, and I know Craig, so that's helpful when you know some of the city councilors and know those that really want to help Indigenous people, and he happens to be one. Yeah. Okay. Is that it?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nakuset.
I'm sorry I can't stay for your presentation, but I got to run. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nakuset. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Oops. I got a lot of paper here, but it's not all talk. Some of it's show. Yeah, it's been quite a week, and for me, I just have to say, it's so great. It's been great to sort of share the time with so many people who are so passionate about their work. And when I say the work, I mean the work of making change, because the world sure does need some change. But I'm going to say a few words about myself and how I sort of came here in a minute or two, but I'm going to start with this. We were housed at Alternatives, sleeping on the floor. It was very comfortable. On my first night, I got up at around 3:30 in the morning and went downstairs and sat on the front steps. And across the street in the little park, there was a young homeless man preparing his bed for the night. He He went through his bags, got a few things out, and then he very carefully unfurled his sleeping bag and another sheet, and sort of tucked himself in. And I have to tell you, maybe it's my age, maybe it's how long I've been in the field, how many homeless people I've buried, how long I've fought against the issue of homelessness and for housing, but this feeling of great grief came over me, and a kind of tenderness. And then I went back to sleep and slept for a few more hours and came downstairs again, and he was just a huddled shape under the blanket. Couldn't see him. And then I felt rage, to the point where I thought, wow, maybe I'm losing it, But in fact, rage and tenderness and compassion all kind of exist together in the activist constellation. So, gotta just get this out of the way. There are 7,500 people in the city shelter system in Toronto. They're 100% full. By law, they're not supposed to operate over 90% because they're an emergency service, but they're full, and they've been full for years. So there's 7,500 people there. Another 1,000 people are in temporary, what we call respite shelters or overnight drop-ins. And when we talk about respite centers, we're talking about places where people sleep 6 or 7 inches apart from each other on cots, 200 to a shelter. Good luck in getting a good night's sleep. And where there's infectious diseases, and you can imagine, when you put that many people in an overcrowded situation like that, you're going to have violence at times, Right now, we're losing 2 people a week in Toronto. 2 homeless people a week. There are 1,000 names on the homeless memorial. And just before I came, I actually went to attend an action around the closing of one of the respite shelters in the city because the city, having refused our demands to declare homelessness an emergency in the city of Toronto, to force all 3 levels of government to respond to that emergency, are promptly closing down around 400 beds. So maybe I was thinking of all that when I was watching the young man try to tuck himself in for the night. So really quickly, I want to read this, because I asked my friend Kathy Crow, who's a colleague, and we were together with a bunch of other activists to form the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee, and I'll say a few words about that and what we did and what we demanded in a little while. Here's her message to you, and it's written for you all. It is wrong that a 74-year-old man is forced to live in a shelter. It is shameful to not be able to offer an Aboriginal man or woman shelter space or housing that meets their needs as a First Nation person. It is wrong that by noon, all detox beds are full and people needing that support are left to languish on the sidewalks. It is wrong that a woman with HIV infection or AIDS lives in an emergency shelter space. It is wrong for the police to institutionalize and jail people simply because they have no income or housing or because they sleep in a park. And also, despite all our great efforts, which I participated in, if anything, this country is worse than it's ever been. Our long fight for a national housing program is not realized. Whatever is promised in Ottawa is smoke and mirrors. And it appears to support more of private development than it does, and private landlords, than it does social housing. Those 2 words which governments do not like to speak. Everyone wants to speak about affordable housing. Well, no, we want to speak about social housing. So you know exactly what we mean. This is deep need housing. So that's a message from Kathy, and she also wants to send her greetings for you in terms of your commitment to fighting for community ownership and to oppose gentrification. which in many parts of downtown Toronto, whole neighborhoods have been destroyed. Low-income neighborhoods have been completely destroyed by condo development. We are fighting that in Parkdale, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But first, let me just introduce myself. I didn't want to do it right away. So my name is Bob Rose, and I have worked in Parkdale for 40 years, lived in Park for 40 years, worked there for about 37 years, and of that time I've spent 32 years working at Park, which is the home of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. But I'm a psychiatric survivor as well, so maybe that's the most important thing to tell you. That's part of the reason that I ended up working in the field of mental health. And not just working in the field of mental health, but trying to change mental health practices, having seen and experienced directly the worst of them. So when I first came to Parkdale, I was coming out with training from Boston University, from Bill Anthony and Marian Farkas, who were kind of pioneers in the recovery movement. And I found myself plunked down as an outreach worker in Parkdale, going into the rooming houses and the boarding homes to witness the results of deinstitutionalization, which was the dumping of people into the worst kind of housing you can ever imagine. 4 to a room, landlords harassing, landlords sexually attacking, crazy, and poverty, deep, deep poverty. So it wasn't very long. It wasn't very long at all, heartbeat actually, before I had to kind of set aside some of my interest, which is what got me into the whole field to begin with the experience of, of mental health, difficulties, crisis, psychosis. And to kind of sort of say, well, you actually have to focus on the basic needs here, People don't have a place to live. They don't have enough food to eat. They don't have enough income to live on. They don't have any hope because we've dumped them. And first we gave them the diagnosis, which, okay, you have schizophrenia. Second, because this is what was being said to people in those days, and it probably still is for some, second, you're never going to be able to work. You're never going to be able to have an intimate relationship. And you're going to have a life of poverty. So good luck to you. Now you're out of the hospital and in the community. So I got myself tangled up in inquests and various newspaper articles and all that kind of stuff about the housing situation for deinstitutionalized people. And ultimately, that took me into a partnership with an activist at Park and eventually a transition into that place as a worker. But at that time, and Park's 37 years old now, and you probably can tell if you've heard the Parkdale Land Trust people speak, there's a lot of complex things coming out of that place right now. That it isn't just about the programs at the heart of the center, but also about new directions that are strategic directions to fight in different kinds of ways for the rights and the resources that people need to live well. Through such things as the Parkdale People's Economy or the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. But if we step back from that, none of that would be possible without the work over many years to build a community within that center. And I remember it was like a big wake-up call that I actually had to work in Park in a way that was quite different than being an outreach worker. In other words, I needed to work in a way that was about fostering and facilitating the social relationships of connection with people with each other. Because what I was seeing there, of course, is mutual support, it's peer support, before the words peer support were even pronounced. And as a worker there, asking yourself and asking the other people you were surrounded with the most critical question of all, which is, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? Who do you want to do it with? And what do you need to do it? So those are the kind of questions that are informing the development of Park and the development of that community and the development of community celebrations and small group programs that cover just a wide swath of territory that are largely centered on voice and the recovery of people's voice. Because when people walked into park, of course, they are silent very often, or they were angry. And most of all, they were isolated. And social isolation is the killer. It's the killer in any ordinary community. It's even more of a killer for people who are vulnerable, if you've been in crisis, you know, where your identity starts to fragment and come apart. I know from my own personal experience, the worst moments of depression, the deepest depression, the first thing I was trying to do was keep everybody away from me. You know? So, in many ways, the beginnings of Park is a rebellion. It's a rebellion against the mental health system as it existed at that time. There were no files. There were no files. We did things together with the members. We had conversations with them about what do you want to do, and we built programs based on those things. And guess what? They were meaningful. People came because it's what they wanted. I'm going to jump ahead here just a bit. I asked a member one time, what did he think of Park, you know? And he said, I think it's the last resort. But I also asked somebody else that question, and they said, what they wanted from Park was a place that was in touch with the heart, the body, human rights, citizenship, dignity, hope, joy. They had a long list. And then they said, I want it to be the road to soul. So I'd like to think we have actually walked on that road. Sometimes we've strayed off it, but we've walked on the road to soul for quite a few years over the 37 years of Park's history. And we've made lots of different programs, you know, so I'm not going to go through the long list of them, but it's kind of interesting that when I saw the picture of the new Native housing, First Nations housing, I thought, well, isn't that interesting that the 29 units of housing that Park has, well, we have 39, but the 29 in the building next door to us was actually a burned out rooming house when we got it. Isn't that curious, you know? The most important things, I think, I'm going to say these three things, and I'd like to think these play a part in, well, I've heard them in some of the conversations about land trusts and land trust directions or new economic development thinking, was that our responsibilities as we defined them in terms of operating a place like Park was that the first responsibility was safety, to ensure the personal safety of people coming in, and then also to translate, what does that mean, personal safety? Well, if you need a meal, we make a meal, you know. You need access to the transit. But you also, you know, just acceptance and trust to be working with those things to help people feel safe who are coming from a place where their safety has been so badly compromised, seems to me to be a very good starting point. So for quite a while, until we became more aware, the focus was really around that, and even the programs we were kind of creating together with the members had the themes of safety were kind of there all the time. But then we noticed over time, as people kept coming, and we knew this, I knew this from recovery research, that people recover from mental health episodes and crises. They will recover with medication or without medication. But sometimes the time frame is not going to be the same as if you went to the hospital and needed a bit of surgery and they did it and sent you home. It may take some years. It depends on what other factors are in your life. And of course, having a home is a pretty solid starting place, a crucial and essential starting place for recovery. But what happens in the recovery process? Well, that's pretty interesting, because I think the second step on this path is all about identity. When you get ill, when you get homeless, your identity is stripped away from you. Your humanity is stripped away from you. You ever pause to think about what folks sitting on the street must feel, even if it's not consciously at the time, of how people walk by them and never look at them, just ignore them. And then the third one is community or social relationships. There's been a lot of talk about social relationships, how important they are. Social connection, that's essential to planning, and it's certainly essential to organizing. Constantly having conversations with people saying, you don't think I'm going to be able to organize a turnout for this particular action by standing at the front of the room and making an announcement about it, do you? You have to talk to people. You have to get into conversation with people. So we've done, I guess I would say for myself, Park, maybe it would always be this, Park has done good work, but not good enough. And we're being challenged in a big time way by what is happening in our neighborhood, the forces that we are facing with the destruction of affordable housing and the takeover by these large corporate landlords who are not just sweeping up the towers, but are sweeping up the smaller buildings with the bachelor apartments, is huge. Huge. So I guess this leads me to make a comment here, which is, if you were going to take away a couple of things from this little talk I'm giving you, I would like you to take back and consider whether you should, in terms of the structure of your land trust or your land trust governance, have some component or build a component that is paying attention to the homelessness disaster that surrounds you, one, and two, has the capacity to organize and focus on direct action, which is sometimes not so easy for some organizations to do. I think that would be a wonderful takeaway from this conference. So I'm going to show you this. This is like a historic document. This is the State of Emergency Declaration developed in 1998 by the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee and the community in Toronto. And it is a statement and a description, it is information, research-based information on the conditions of homelessness that were affecting the city at that time, which was, it was huge, but not as huge as what's going on right now. And this declaration of disaster was approved and endorsed by Toronto City Council. And then Jack Layton, who was working with us at that time, he was a councillor, took this across the country where all kinds of cities, large and small, Vancouver, Winnipeg, London, so on, declared and endorsed this. And what it called for is what we still do not have. It called for 1% of the federal budget, 1% of a municipal budget, and 1% of the provincial budget to be invested in housing every year. And asked for 5 years, every year. And if we'd won that battle back, believe me, it wasn't just 98 we were working on it. If we'd won that battle, you can imagine how much housing would have been built since that time, all over the country. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little story because I'm going to wrap up. This is to give you an idea of what it's like to work with someone who's homeless and about to be displaced or discarded or arrested by the police. I got a call from a city manager who had a team of people who would visit the parks and so on. So she knew me, and she had an issue with had a problem situation with a young man named Alan who was sleeping on the railway lands that had been sold to a private developer. And her people, her staff, had not been able to persuade him to leave his encampment down there. And she had a time deadline where the police were going to come. And she asked me if I could help. So I said, yeah, let me try. Give me 3 weeks. You tell your staff to stay away. No communications with him, just me. So I went down, befriended him over a few days, found out that why he was living there because he was gathering things from the street to sell. And of course, what he couldn't sell ended up in the storage lockers that he was sleeping quite close to. In other words, he was trying to keep from going insane by having a little business, okay? It's just that it turned into a big business and his income check was completely swallowed by the cost of these rentals. So, this is the history of mental health, is getting pushed from place to place to place. It's actually the story of mental health treatment. First we send you to prison, then we send you to Bedlam, then we send you to an asylum, now we send you to the country, now we send you back to the city, the hospital, the boarding home, wherever, don't sleep on the park benches. We're putting dividers in, which is, of course, why we're working so hard. Land Trust is working so hard with preservation strategies in the West End because there are many survivors who come to Park who live there. And if they get displaced from that community, I don't want to think about what's going to happen. But here's what happened at this end of this story. I was working and it was coming right down to the wire. I had 24 hours and the police were going to arrive. And I'd already been talking to a gal that I knew who managed a sort of more progressive transitional kind of housing called Street City. And she was working on getting me a place. And my God, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon the day before, I had to kind of see if I could get Alan out of there. She called me and said, we have a place. So he was happy to go. We tarped his encampment for the last time together. And then he gave me a present, which is a pair of socks that had a little musical diode in them that played Winter Time is Coming. So when we walked into his new home, I had the socks on my hands and playing the song. And we went and sat in his place. And I said, he looked at me and he said, Bob, coming from the outside to the inside is a pretty big deal. I said, yes, it is. Yes, it is, Alan. Why is it such a big deal? And he goes, well, it's all a question of attitudes and latitudes. There's a bit of wisdom in that, in terms of maintaining your perspective. I'm going to finish with this last little anecdote. And also mention that that in Parkdale, working with, in terms of what I was saying about setting up another structure in relationship to your land trust that's doing advocacy, maybe going to see people in the rooming houses or the boarding homes where people are at risk of displacement and providing support to them. I'm with the Parkdale Eviction Resistance Network, so we are trying to build that as well, right? And if any of you in the audience want to talk about doing that, chat with me when I leave if you catch me or give me your contact number. So this is my last little story. And the reason I'm going to tell you this is because beside Park, there is supportive housing, 29 units, in what was an old deteriorated rooming house with a landlord that regularly kicked people out on the street. But that building burned in 1998 and sat empty for quite a few years. The roof had fallen in. And it's the only building, to my knowledge, that has ever been expropriated by the City of Toronto. Because we were pushing the city to have councillors identify derelict properties for the purpose of conversion into housing. Well, this one got expropriated. So that leads me to make a second comment, is in terms of having a parallel structure within your land trust that's about direct action and resistance and protecting people, you can also consider the discussion that we may need to have about more radical strategies to deal with the situation that we're in. And then what I'm talking about here is the expropriation of properties. You know, I'm thinking of and how that can be done or how that can be pressed. The cities have some responsibility to see that speculators don't get to hold properties for years and years and years while people are dying on the streets. We don't take it away from you. And in fact, the story of this building is partly based on the story of Edmund Yu, who is someone I met wearing 7 layers of black, holding a check in his hand, evicted from that rooming house, and he had 6 watches on his arm. And he wanted the 7th one, which was on mine. But he was a young man in struggle. And I got a chance to walk with Edmund for a few months. He was a very unusual person, until he was shot by police on a bus. So these stories, this kind of story, the story of the fire, the story of the young man Edmund Yu, who was studying to be a doctor until his father died, and then he had a breakdown, then he ended up in the hospital, then he got forcibly medicated, then he got put in the boarding home where he was allowed to just sit and be isolated and contemplate that he had no future. The story of that, combined with the story of the fire, is one of the ways that we were able to get that burned out rooming house and turn it into a place where people could live. And how did that all happen? I think in some ways it was measured by my closing remark, which is when I stood in the snow with Edmund one night after failing to get him into a place that he could stay in, he looked at me and I was really upset because I had to go home and he was on the street. And he looked at me and he put his arm on my shoulder and said, "Bob, reality is sometimes painful. There is no place in the world for me." And that's our job. I think it's the job of the whole conference, is figure out how to make places in the world for people. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Sure.
We're going to take some questions. Si vous avez des questions. Bob, do you understand French?
No.
No? Okay. So we'll translate if needed. Hold on. Does anyone have questions?
What do you say for people that say they prefer to be on the street?
Pardon me?
What do you say for homeless people that say they prefer to be on the street? They don't want to be in a building.
I would say they don't really. That's not really a true answer. They may prefer not to be in the places that are offered to them, if there's anything being offered to them. People end up on the street not because they prefer to be there, but because there's no access to the kind of housing and home that they need. That's it.
Thank you so much. I'm also a psychiatric survivor, and I also have been a street health outreach worker. So I'm really inspired by what you're saying, and I live in Ottawa. I started working at the Shepherds of Good Hope. It's a big shelter, men's shelter, run by the Grey Nuns, and then there's the Mission and the Salvation Army. And I'm really, obviously I don't think it's good to close shelter beds, but shelters themselves are a big problem. And how do we take radical approaches to the population living in shelters and try to transform those situations?
It's a really tough one, and of course the tough question. A lot of times, the city, in fact, is cutting back. We're cutting back on resources to the shelters. People say shelters are not the solution. Housing's the solution, and I totally agree that housing is the solution. But we have a responsibility when people are, you know, in an emergency situation, like being on the street, to respond and respond with standards and, you know, quality space for people and supports within that space. And the reality is that the city, at least the city of Toronto, I don't know about other cities, have not been taking the prompts and the encouragement given to them to kind of get ready, get prepared, change your standards, hire the staff, build the spaces, get ready. So they haven't been doing that. And so who pays the price? The people who are homeless, right? And yeah, right, they go into shelters that are unsafe or don't want to go into shelters at all because, you know, they're vulnerable. Edmund, for example, who I was talking about, he wouldn't go to a shelter for sure. He'd probably get beaten up in a shelter because he talked to himself all the time, you know? So, anyway. I know I gotta go on the bus, so I'm worried about that.
Anybody?
We'll just call it a day. Okay, any other questions? Good.
Not a question, Bob, but more of a statement. One of the things I do in my community, which is Parkdale, is that oftentimes I meet psychiatric survivors and I befriend them. I say hi. And usually I have 3 young children, 11 and under, and they would say, oh, no, mom, no. You know, when I approach them to say hi or even give them, but I could share a quick story. There's this guy, Wayne, in Parkdale, at Parkdale Library. Usually we gather there Monday to Friday, women and men, and we socialize. So there's this guy, Wayne, when it was his birthday last year, guess where he came? At the Parkdale Library for us to celebrate. So we have a little corner in the library where we gather, and we sing him happy birthday. So he knew exactly where to find us, where to find me, and we wish him happy birthday, we sing him happy birthday. So I'm just saying, sometimes...
Sweet.
Thank you. Sometimes, you know, we might not have a bed to give them at night to sleep, but we could befriend them and let them feel that they are significant, they are important, and they could make a big contribution to society.
Yeah, we can all enjoy that stuff.
We could all play our role in society.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. So I suppose it's going to close. Nobody else have a question? Personne d'autre a une question? Non? Bon, ben merci pour votre participation et merci à Bob pour cette belle présentation. Thank you.